For the last few months, Mr. Speaker, the US forces has been trying very hard in order to stop the forces of ISIS in regions such as Mosul and Kobani, for instance. We think the efforts that have been taken on by Obama, in essence, have been futile in nature because of the inability, right, to collaborate with Assad into channeling their forces in order to stop ISIS as a whole. We think because of the loophole that exists within the Syrian people in their inability to collaborate and to cooperate with the already existing forces like the Peshmerga or the Iraqi forces has caused us to come to a compromise, right, that we need to do something, that because of the time sensitivity of this issue, that ISIS is continuing to crack down on civilians, continuing to kill women and children alike. We think something needs to be done, right? Something of urgency in our time. We think in status quo, Mr. Speaker, it's not like we haven't tried, right? Like Obama has already tried to have talks of collaboration with Assad against ISIS. But because of the conservative nature of the Alawite, have a seat. Because of the conservative nature of the Alawite community as well, right? That Assad has no incentive then to collaborate with the US because he wants to show that, hey, I'm a dictator, I can take care of this shit. But we think that it's high time that we have some form of, if he is unwilling to collaborate with the US or the other external forces, it's high time that we assassinate him, right? We think time sensitivity is an issue. We'd rather this trade-off, the lesser of two evils. Have a seat. Our solution in opening government is we would rather assassinate Bashar al-Assad, right? Considering the coalition of willing countries that we already have, such as the UK and France, that has been supplying medical aid, and forces such as the Iraqi forces themselves, right, within their own country, the Peshmerga forces who are also very anti-ISIS and also anti-Bashar in nature. We also see Middle Eastern countries such as Saudi Arabia and Turkey channeling not only funds but troops as well in order to counter ISIS. We think it's high time, right? Seeing that Syria is a big opposition towards the control of ISIS, we think this is legitimate. Several mechanisms, right, before opposition gets really crazy about this debate. Firstly, once we assassinate Assad, we are going to make sure that there is an interim government that has been set up, that we will collaborate with this new opposition. Who is this new opposition? This new opposition comprises of the Syrian opposition party, essentially. It could be the Syrian Free Army, for instance, as long as they fill the basic criteria that, number one, they support the fight against ISIS, and number two, that they also have this willingness to collaborate with this coalition of countries that we are talking about, right? They're not only Western countries. I told you, like Saudi and Turkey are also anti-ISIS in nature. Eventually, when we do bring down ISIS, and we believe that we can, right, with this new form of coalition, we'll be able, once we've killed the ISIS forces, the ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, that we would return power back to the people, right? It's simple mechanism. We think the political accountability within these countries, like the UN, for example, how UN peacekeeping forces construct interim systematically leave. We think it's a system that has been done before in other countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. We think it's also applicable in this sense. I'm going to tell you two main extensions, right? Two substantives. Firstly, I'll tell you why there is inherent need to remove Assad. And secondly, I'll tell you why this new leader will offer better collaboration in stopping the common enemy, and that is ISIS. But before I move on, opening.
Yeah. So are you advocating for a full-fledged military intervention and occupation?
No.
And if so, who is doing this?
No. If you listen to their wording, it'll sound like we're invading Syria. But you need to focus on this debate, right, ladies and gentlemen? The main threat today is the ISIS forces. We need to take him out essentially first before we think about secondary ideas such as the Syrian stability, for instance. We think eventually we would also render this power back to them. But you need to get your priorities right? That if you see this as an intervention, we think that the ability to collaborate would be lost in that sense. Let's look at the first idea that we have, right? Why there is an inherent need to remove Assad. As of now in status quo, Obama has just sent 200,000 extra combatants into Iraq to close in on Assad. But his efforts have been redundant. Why? Because number one, no thank you. Because the ISIS forces keep retreating back into Syria to resupply resupply and regroup. We think because of this basic characterization, there is an inability to fully crack down on them, right? We need to ensure that these guerrilla forces, when they retreat back to Syria, are not given any idea or any ability to regroup or reallocate their own forces. We think the problem is that, right, exactly, that ISIS keeps running into Damascus or Syria, and this the problem towards what we talked about, to have any accessibility to counter ISIS in general. The harms of this, right, that if you look at this pessimistic view on the opposition, that we don't want to intervene because, hey, we sovereignty of states, right? We think that it's gonna waste a lot of time. We think it's wasting a lot of effort, even as of now in itself, how you continuously perpetuate to allow and how forces all gallant in countering effect, because you are if us opening government incentive to fight against ISIS, we think it has efficient in its sense, because every time Assad channels his
otherwise in order to resolve the situation in Syria. But let's isn't necessarily as bad as draw the differences in the nature of ISIS and Assad, right? ISIS adopts a hardline stance that involves space for negotiation or compromise with the people who oppose ISIS. Assad, on the other hand, has shown a trend whereby he is okay to a limited extent to accepting negotiated deals. The reason why pressure from the US resulted in chemical weapons being shipped out of Syria by the OPCW itself is a reflection of the fact that at some level we are able to engage constructively with Assad. It offers a space and an opening for us that we can explore. Islamic State negotiating with its opposers simply doesn't. That means that there's greater scope for us to deal with the Assad government in different ways after act against the ISIS state. But we also think that the ISIS government coming to greater power is a bad thing for Syrian citizens and everyone else.
While you will continue to fight against IS, you are very much okay with allowing Bashar to continue his reign of terror over Syria.
We are not supporting Assad's reign of Syria or any support that he might give to overseas forces. But we think we have to pick our fights. We think that we are acting openly, militarily against the ISIS. We are putting pressure on him if required through threats of military intervention. That's not something that we are shying away from. It's a question of sequencing that debate. We need to understand that if encouraged and strengthened in Syria, that's not necessary to offer people at large either. Because while the Syrian conflict is bad itself, Assad's ambition lead to the borders of Syria. It's getting killed in the process, and that's not something we condone. But at least his danger is territorial borders of Syria. ISIS has a much more ambitious plan. They want to take over regional control by establishing the Islamic Caliphate. In fact, their mandate extends to every non-Islamic state and every non-Islamic Caliphate state that exists in the world. We think that the danger that they pose to the global community at large is much graver than the one that we possesses. We also think that Syrian citizens if they were to come under the control of ISIS as a result of ISIS being strengthened by our taking out of Assad, will not necessarily have any better a way of life than under Assad, right? Because the ethnic basis of the conflict in Syria means that the warring factions have both been committing atrocities in Syria. It's not just Assad who has been killing innocent civilians. Other people, including the IS, including other rebel factions, have also been doing that. We don't think you're necessarily solving the problem in Syria. We think you're going to send Syria into a situation of chaos where there is going to be no one person with whom you can cooperate. And we think you're going to be unduly encouraging the ISIS and strengthening it in its fight against every reasonable community in the world. For these reasons, we are very proud to oppose this move.
We'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue this debate. Yeah.
So opposition agree that we need to obliterate ISIS in their own terms. But they're against a full-fledged military intervention because apparently it will put Syria into chaos. So what are you achieving on side opening opposition? Do you want to obliterate Syria, but on the same time, you're not willing to go into, obliterate ISIS, who is hiding in Syria, but you're not willing to go in a full-fledged military force? But if you recognize the nature of how ISIS functions, it is a military group. It has huge military capabilities, which means the only way for you to take them out is through a military intervention. So you cannot give me arguments and say, no, we cannot intervene because it will put Syria into chaos, because you can solve the problem, because you have to take on that mechanism also. We agree, ISIS is a greater threat than Assad, which is why then it is important for us to use and take out Assad first as a stepping stone for us to achieve the greater aim of taking out ISIS. Several said this idea, we need to smartly pick a fight. that when you kill Assad, Assad's own people and his army will retaliate, and then it will be conflict. Let's analyze, why do Assad supporters support Assad? In a war-torn nation where you have no other option to turn to, is either you follow Assad or you die. We think a majority of his supporters are following him out of desperation because they have no choice, because if you choose to turn away from Assad, he can simply kill you. But even if there are a small fraction of people who would choose to rise up against Assad, that is merely one of the combat that we need to fight, because recognize that you're entering into a war zone anyway. They can see you already have different factions fighting. Why can't we use our usual military tactics of choosing which side to fight and choosing who to spare? Thirdly, this idea of warring factions. The warring faction, or currently the war that is happening in Syria right now, is three ways: Assad, ISIS, forces. It is very common. In fact, ISIS is the only common enemy that all the later. But if you look at the opposition forces, they are also US friendly. So I argue that Assad has openly invited US to intervene. The opposition forces, while the Syrian Free Army, while they were oppressed by Assad, they also openly call for US to come in and help them in the past. So we think the people on the ground there can give us the sufficient support that we need to go in to obliterate Assad first and then take out ISIS. And that was the substantive that Sarah brought to you that was just dismissed, right? But lastly, you alienate the support that you get from the Arab states. As I told you, the majority of countries in the Middle East hate Syria and Assad to its bone. When Syria is the common, when ISIS is the common enemy, and the end goal is for us to take out ISIS, you can already see the support. Turkey from Saudi. The only country that we think you will alienate and is the sole ally of Syria and ISIS is Iran, which US has never really given a fuck about. No offense to Deborah. Go.
Taking away Assad hurts our chances of taking away ISIS. Yeah. We can't even guarantee that removal of Assad will definitely remove the Assad regime.
Okay. Why can't we cooperate with Assad? Yes, he openly asked for us to work with him, but he has proven himself to be dangerous, to be violent. In covert operations, they are geographically located in various headquarters far apart from each other. They have a huge transmission of secret orders, right? And a lot of times you don't even know who are in the ranks because their identities are kept secret. Because terrorist groups function primarily on the premise of trust. The moment that that ISIS knows, or terrorist groups in general know that US is willing to carry out covert operations such as assassination, it disrupts the chain of command. It disrupts the ability for them to trust each other or to trust the commanders in general. And we think that is highly disruptive to the ISIS cooperations. But let's look at the regional differences and what are the kind of support that we can get in general. Like I told you, the Middle East countries are pretty much against Assad, which is why you have only Iran who has explicitly aligning itself to Assad. Syria's problem has overflowed to a multitude of other countries, such as Jordan, such as even Saudi, Turkey. And all these other countries are personally have a stake in stopping the Assad regime. We think the moment US chooses to go in, firstly, not only you can garner that form of support for your operations of taking out ISIS from more of these countries because they're happy that you take out their common enemy. Secondly, as opposed to what opposition want you to believe, it actually establishes a long-term trust in each other, or at least a safer ground for communications, because now you believe that you have taken, they think that you have taken out a common enemy for them. We think for all those reasons, it is very important. Primarily, if you recognize that ISIS is a threat, and what is the best way for us to take them out? The biggest obstruction right now is Syria, because the land is locked and we cannot achieve. And the guerrilla warfare tactics that ISIS is using means that we'll constantly never be able to, the war that we have to fight is very long drawn, because they can always retreat to a safe haven. For us to access Syria, we have to take out Assad. We're very proud to propose.
To end the opening half of this debate, I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, this debate isn't a question of whether we are going to work with Bashar al-Assad and therefore condone all his actions. This is a debate about assessing whether we should work against him and whether or not that is going to be effective in the long-term foreign policy objectives or to create stability in the Middle East. It's ironic that opening government comes up here to tell us and concedes point blank that ISIS is a greater threat than Syria, but wants to take out the only man within the Middle East with the capacity to fight them, who has shown willingness to cooperate with the US forces. We simply don't understand that logic. So now that we've all conceded that priority is taking out ISIS, this debate will then function, and opposition bench will then prove to you why taking out Bashar al-Assad is antithetical to trying to achieve stability within the region. Before I move on to my arguments proper, two questions. The first one, do we need to take out Assad to create progress within the region? They came up here and told us that assassinations are important so that we gain things like access to land, access to intelligence, cooperation within these areas. But one, the first question we come up here and ask you is, assassinations don't create very clear transitions of power, do they? The fact that you have no plan to decide who's the government that's going to be in interim period and why they will cooperate with you is already a problem. But secondly, even if I assume there was not a single Assad loyalist out there, the fact that the multifaceted nature of the opposition forces within Syria means there is no clear ruler. They all fight with their own self-interested reasons, and that means Syria descends into an all-out war with no clear power, with no clear governance at any way. So you still don't achieve that kind of cooperation that suddenly you think helps you fight ISIS simply because of the multifaceted nature. But you forget that the Assad regime does have many loyalists, and they said, well, they're fighting out of desperation. This is completely disingenuous because it completely misses the point of why there even is fighting within Syria along ethnic lines, Mr. Speaker. The fact that there's ethnic tensions between Sunni and Shia individuals within the state of Syria, that's why we think the military will continue to be Assad loyalists within the regime, while you will still be removing him that creates any form of cooperation anyway. But even if you allow for the opposition forces to take over and there's clear governance, they've been shown that they're as willing to commit as many war crimes as Assad has been within that region anyway. So we don't see why the cooperation does yield any more results. So on all levels, we don't think this works. Secondly, they came up here and said, oh, but we need, secondly, they came up and said, deposing it helps us fight ISIS. That's fundamentally disingenuous, considering that Anil already established to you, one, the fact that his armed forces have continued to push back ISIS forces and fight ISIS forces within Syria is great ground, is a great number of people, that a great number of military support we actually need. But secondly, the fact that he's been willing to have cooperations and give up intelligence towards the US to make sure they can have more targeted strikes already shows that we need him in the fight against ISIS to begin with. But thirdly, we also told you that having this or fighting Assad makes it much worse because you alienate every other country that's allowed you to be so successful with ISIS so far. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all these regions that have provided not just like intelligence support, but the legitimacy of your aim to be able to take out ISIS within the region. The same people who oppose intervention within Syria because they clearly don't want Assad out of power. These are reasons why, on all grounds, we don't think side opening government's case stands at all. I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk to you about why we need to choose what the path of least resistance is in this debate. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why this strengthens ISIS, and this is something we cannot afford to have within the Syrian state. Before I go on, does that appear if I'm closing?
Why do you think assisting Bashar in taking out ISIS will will somehow garner more people to our cause rather than pushing more people to IS when we're seen as complicit with Bashar's crimes?
Because we think that everybody fundamentally concedes that the IS is a worse enemy than Syria is within that region. So we think we understand the priorities there to do that anyway. First one, parts of Leade's resistance. Let's realize that we also accept that both regimes are somewhat undesirable. And in an ideal world, we would have neither. But in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, it's about understanding in deciding where we're going to assess allegiances in foreign policy. We need to choose the path of least resistance. So what does that mean? One, you cannot afford to make a decision that incapacitates you from doing any further good within that region to begin with. The fact that you are making this decision, even if it's morally right to do so, to oppose Bashar al-Assad, incapacitates you from having any further influence or doing any amount of good within that region to not just combat ISIS, to also have the kinds of military pressure post-ISIS, assuming we ever take them out, by the way, like post-ISIS against Bashar al-Assad to begin with. But secondly, the moral ambiguity behind it, right? We all understand that both regimes are bad, but at the very least, we know that removing ISIS from power is a clearly unambiguous goal because they are that cruel within the states. Removing Bashar al-Assad from power is morally ambiguous because we don't know who's going to replace him and we don't know how much worse things will get within that area to begin with. So on both counts, on assessing which is the most strategic decision to make, we don't think you're making the path of least resistance in what is logical to begin with, Mr. Speaker. But secondly, we came up here and also told you, we need to come up here and tell you that every incentive to fight within these regions is now gone when you make the move that incapacitates you. How does that happen? We told you that not only do they provide legitimacy and intelligence from neighboring countries within the Islamic State, they've also provided very important military provisos for the ability for us to be able to launch strikes, pilots, be able to provide military bases, boots on the ground. All these things are important aspects of being able to fight the ISIS, something that Gulf Bench concedes is the greater threat within this region from neighboring states like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. You doing this makes you much harder for you to be able to make any further progress within the war. That is problematic. Second question, how does this strengthen the IS rebels? Okay, like this is pretty mathematical, right? No Assad, more IS members, because they have more support. It's almost arithmetic in nature. So they will be able to have greater control within these regions, to have greater amount of influence within the state. We told you why this is fundamentally worse. The reason why it's worse is because while we accept the moral atrocities that Bashar has done, and we can never condone that, nobody can, what happens is that at the very least, Syria's ambitions are contained within the state of Syria, and all he wants is to remain in control. We've also told you that he's more willing to negotiate, red line, chemical warfare, all that, Anil speech, guys. But we told you at the very least, his ambitions are very much limited to within his state. What we also told you is that the ISIS doesn't have those same limitations. They want to establish an Islamic caliphate all across the Middle East and actually across every non-Islamic country in the world. That's what makes it so difficult. While Bashar al-Assad's moral atrocities are bad, they are only bad because the timeline of that conflict is extended much longer than the ISIS has. But comparatively so, within the ISIS is a far more brutal, unconvincing, uncooperative organization within that. Your model empowers them because, one, you lack any political support to fight the ISIS when countries that support Bashar al-Assad withdraw their support from your ability to then have effective engagement with them. But two, also because they've removed the most important resistance to the ISIS control over Syria, which is Bashar al-Assad's armed forces, which is his loyalists. So on all counts, let's realize that their model is just not the path of least resistance in what's logically sequential. But two, not only does it strengthen the ISIS, it creates a scenario where the ISIS, the Syria's rule under ISIS, is far more worse and far more potent. For making the right decision, we're very proud to oppose.
Okay, we are taking a short intermission. To extend this debate, I'd like to invite the member of the government.
To the extent that setting up an interim government is possible, we would really, really love to do so. But what closing government is going to focus on is the far more likely scenario of a targeted assassination, which the motion assumes is feasible, following which perhaps a leader or some military elite of the Alawites will take over Syria. We assume that infighting is going to happen, weakening basically the Syrian government, right? And we think that this is the best case scenario that can happen for the conflict within Syria. Two things I'm going to be talking about in my speech, rebuttals and substantives amalgamated. First, let's talk about how we need to stop IS and why taking out Assad is so crucially linked to the kinds of recruitment that IS is receiving from Syria. Secondly, let's talk about how we then better the Syrian situation, how this actually really combats like that kind of recruitment, right? But before that, let's deal with a few rebuttals that don't fit. Opening opposition's cases rested on two main assumptions. Firstly, killing Assad off will piss off the rest of the Arab states, and therefore, let's not do that. And secondly, Assad's an asshole, right? But he's not the biggest asshole around, so let's keep him around and then focus on him later. Let me just take this down. Look, killing him off pisses off the rest of the Arab states. Guys, that's already not true, right? It's not like we're going to lose support from like Jordan or Egypt on the help of like Jordan or like Saudi Arabia in like trying to combat like IS. Like the Arab coalition has basically expelled Assad from the Arab League. They don't like him very much either. Then they wanted to talk about how this create warring factions within the country. I.e., guys, this has been status quo for the last 3 years, right? But the difference is the warring factions happening now is that the tide has turned. Assad is now winning. The Syrian forces are losing, and so is 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 also winning there. We think that any alternative of any kind of a future hope for any kind of like stable, peaceful government rests amongst the rebel groups, not with either Assad's regime or IS's regime. So like we would actually like there to be some like some hope of that resembling there, right? Then let's talk about how like they want like Kanna wanted to talk about how the Syrian army's help is so crucial to turn the tide against IS. The only response I have to that is that that's bullshit, right? Because Bashar has been fighting IS all along. He has been failing all along. His Syrian army is not as huge as it was maybe 5-6 years ago, simply because people have been leaving his army left, right, center to either join rebel forces or to join the fight against IS. No, thank you. We think that he doesn't have control. Like he wanted to talk about the kinds of military information that he might possibly have that will turn the tides against Syria. No, right? He doesn't have control over northern Syria. IS does. He doesn't have the kind of intelligence over there. There's nothing that he could really offer to the US, which is why he wanted to collaborate with the US to begin with, because like he's been failing all on his own, and having him in the fight isn't really going to be able to change anything. But what makes things worse is that they need to understand what Hazem meant in his POR, that basically the US will now look like they are complicit in Assad's atrocities. Kanna may come up here and say that both regimes are bad, but IS is so much worse. Tell that to the Syrian who is living in Damascus, who has to look to either IS or to like Assad and try to figure out which regime is he going to more likely survive in. Tell that to the guy who has to fight for his life, right? This is basically what they are doing is empowering every bit of IS rhetoric that is calling out to recruits within Syria and calling them to say that, hey, look, the West really is as bad. The West is complicit in Assad and like how he has basically made your life miserable for years, and like you should join us in the fight against them. We don't think this helps the situation, and all this only empowers IS. Yes.
Even if the Syrian army is weaker than before, do you think that them continuing their fight against ISIS is distracting at least some of ISIS's force from their battle in states like Iraq?
Yeah. If there is any kind of like help that they're going to give, we think this is marginal compared to the kind of help we are getting from all the rest of the world, right? We don't think a few thousand more troops from the Syrian army really does anything. We think, in fact, what you do is you boost the IS army, like as I have already mentioned, right? So, like, look, let's look at how we stop IS. We think that, like, we need to understand that we need to understand that Obama's foreign policy has shifted in the last week, because all he has focused on last week is like trying to fund the Syrian rebel armies and giving them weapons. But this has already changed when he ordered airstrikes in Syria specifically to target Assad's army, because he recognizes that the two are interlinked, and weakening one will weaken the other. Because when you don't have Assad around anymore, you don't get more recruits from Syria. We think that what OG meant when they came out to say that people regroup in Damascus means that actually people from Damascus leave Damascus in order to be able to join IS, in order to make sure that Assad doesn't use them as a human meat shield the next week, right? Like we think that like the two, what opposition needs to understand that the two are interlinked, and opposition also needs to be able to understand. And how we better the Syrian situation is that like we need to understand that Assad and the kind of symbolic power that Assad has over his country, right? It was really, really weird for I don't know, I think there was a bit of a tension within opening opposition's case when the LO comes up here to tell us that the military can operate completely fine on its own, and then Kanna comes up to contradict him later by saying that no, there'll be lots and lots of infighting, there's already lots of division within the Syrian government, within itself, right? We think that actually the latter is true, that basically Assad is the one holding the entire Syrian government by the strength of, I don't know, charisma, some kind of thing that basically where his bloodline has been worshipped as gods, and this is something he has inherited from his dad, right? And we think that to be able to take them, we think that nobody else in Syria could possibly fill in the power vacuum he will leave once he is assassinated. We think that we think that the best case scenario obviously is for a more sensible person from the military government who is tired of the infighting, who realizes the huge threat IS has towards them, and basically set up a better government. But we think even when we take the worst case scenario, it is still a better scenario than it is right now, where Assad and his family, where we basically take him out and leave the military in absolute disarray. We think that basically when the Alawites are basically fighting over each other for that kind of power amongst all the different generals, this at least means that the Syrian Free Army has some form of reprieve from all the fighting they received from the attacks they received from both IS as well as the Syrian National Army, and maybe the Free Army has some form of chance of gaining some more legitimacy within the ground and collaborate with perhaps a more sensible military leader, leaving Syria a far more peaceful place in the future than the absolute disarray it is right now. Only then can we weaken IS. Only then can we stop all the Syrian recruits from going over to them.
All right. Quick reminder: keep the chatting to a minimum. Keep everyone whispers kind of loud. To extend the debate in off, we'd like to invite the member.
Closing opposition will be the bigger team here and engage in both the ISIS debate and also the removal of Assad's regime debate, and be the first bench on this side to engage with both of those paradigms in two extensions. Firstly, we're going to tell you why this will turn the Assad regime to now align themselves with ISIS and now materializing OG's very problem statement that was previously inexistent and turning our chances of battling ISIS into actually zero now. Secondly, we're going to tell you why this permanently changes the dynamics of interaction between Western actors and all rogue states in the global community when we finally tell them that assassination is possible and trust is impossible within those interactions in status quo once your policy is done. Before those two things, a few rebuttals. Firstly, an in-depth critique of their failing model that will never ever materialize any of the benefits that they want on three levels. Firstly, interim government. They have to understand this. They want a new leader, etc. That was extension. You can only get an interim government if you have autonomous control over the locale. If your troops are there to implement new regulations and new leaders. Once you remove Assad, the Assad regime will still remain supreme and they will still have autonomy over the land and the facilities. So you guys want to implement a new interim government, but they'll just say, no, we're the ones who with policemen on the ground actively controlling what's happening, you won't get to materialize any of the benefits that you want. So literally, the outcome that you want can never create any kinds of constructive progress beyond the killing of Assad alone, and nothing else beyond that point that is actually tangible. But the second response, they want to remove Assad and replace it with a Syrian opposition political leader. But we told you what was never engaged with. A united opposition only exists to the extent of removing Assad. Beyond that, there are no existing agreements on what kind of political coalition we want to have. We don't even know whether the Syrian National Council or the Free Syrian Army will succeed within the government. We still disagree on whether or not Syria will be an Islamic state post-Assad's removal. We disagree on what structure of governments that we want. We are from different segments of the community. What we think will happen now in a fragmented civil war, you will further fragment the very opposition that you wanted to protect because of this power vacuum, and therefore the idea of filling in that power vacuum is not a proper thing that you can do unless you can ensure us that political cooperation exists as a premise. We don't think it exists already, and it's shown clearly under status quo. But thirdly, all of your benefits will only materialize once you prove that the Assad regime will fall down. Not a single person on that bench attempted this thought process. We're going to prove you in the opposite, why this will strengthen the Assad regime instead, because all of this anger and remorse will turn Assad into a martyr and strengthen the regime even further to crack down on any opposition on the ground and crack down on Western forces negotiating with them. I'll explain them more in my extension, without which none of your benefits will actually materialize in this debate. You guys have that burden to discharge. Take a seat. Second rebuttal. The idea that a new leader is better, that is both the extension and the argumentation from opening government as well. It's funny how they have the ability to characterize a person who we don't know who it will be. It could easily be another person from within the Assad regime. It could be someone from the Free Syrian Army. It could be someone from the Syrian National Council. You will create a power struggle, not just internally, but within the opposition. Sure, they say that under status quo, we already have a civil war, but civil wars between Assad and the opposition. You're fragmenting the opposition as well. This will be a more manic version of the power struggle that you wanted to avoid, because filling in a power vacuum is a very time-sensitive battle. So you cannot say that this new leader will become more benevolent in nature because you don't know who this individual will be. It might just be Assad's successor, in which case under status quo, we already have a successor. We'll just put him into place and the Assad regime will perfectly continue. The third rebuttal is a question of who is more evil. That is not the debate, guys. We don't like ISIS and we don't like Assad as well. But the thing is, you can kill two birds with one stone if you take out ISIS first, because Assad helps you in the battle of taking out ISIS. What's wrong with having this delay mechanism when you're improving your chances for both battles? You can literally still want to assassinate Assad after you've taken out ISIS. There's no harm in waiting a few more minutes if you better your chances on the holistic battle altogether. But even if you take out Assad first, we're also going to tell you why that's never going to happen within our extension. But lastly, also the extension coming from opposing government. They said if you remove Assad, there'll be less recruits for ISIS. No, it is not, because if you are pro-Assad, you are anti-ISIS, because ISIS threatens the territorial sovereignty of Assad, and all Assad loyalists hate them. In fact, even anti-Assad don't like ISIS, because no one in Syria likes ISIS, Mr. Speaker, because they threaten people on the ground. Everyone hates them, so we don't understand what is the relevance between Syria and Assad's governments existing and people liking or not liking ISIS. There's literally no logical progression of thought right there. Before my first argumentation, yes.
How can you trust Assad as an ally in the battlefield when he deliberately knows that the US has wanted to remove him from power in the past?
Two things. Number one, even if you don't trust Assad, they have proven their trust because we have a common goal. Therefore, we can trust them to achieve this common goal together because they have given us intelligence. They have offered their own troops at stake on the ground, and they have helped us succeed in an actual operation against ISIS. Secondly, we're not cooperating with them for any other foreign policy. We still distrust them. But what happens after we take out ISIS is a different debate. We will still like to have that debate, but this is not the time for it. ISIS is now. Firstly, Assad regime becomes pro-ISIS. Assad's regime now will have to pick their battles and now answer the question on who is the worst enemy, because they are very anti-ISIS, because ISIS challenges their territorial sovereignty by taking away their land and wanting to establish an Islamic state, and they want to persecute anyone else. But what this assassination will tell them is that the West is the bigger enemy, because ISIS has never made a direct attack towards our leadership or towards our regime. All we had was sporadic attacks in isolated areas and recruitments in general. This is a direct attack to your leadership and a direct message that says we want to disassemble your sovereignty and disassemble your governance. But what happened is you will radicalize the Assad regime, and ISIS will jump on this opportunity to say that you should come with us on this bandwagon because we hate the West as well. Two things will happen. One, ISIS will use Assad as a martyr and as a rallying point to now recruit Assad loyalists on the ground to say that we have a common enemy, and we will help you remove and achieve your first goal of prioritization, which is taking away the person who wants to take away your sovereignty. But secondly, the anger and remorse will blind their rationality because you don't have constructive engagement and you suddenly want to replace with some democratic government. They will consider this a new fight, and who will help them in that battle? ISIS will help them in that battle. What you will create is a bigger enemy for all of us, and no one to help us in the battle against ISIS, because now we don't have accessibility, and now we don't have intelligence, all the problems that they wanted to avoid. Secondly, dynamics of interaction. Rogue states and Western actors are now cooperating because you have an environment of trust. When Western states say that we uphold the principles of international justice, we don't do preemptive strikes, we don't do assassination. Even though we have a lot of assassination debates, we've never assassinated the leader of a rogue state. We've only had terrorists assassinate leaders of good states, right? What we will tell people now is that Western states no longer fulfill the principles of international human rights that they stand for. They no longer care about your legitimacy or rogue nations. You will change the state of security and trust into one of paranoia. And we know what paranoid states will do. They will create more radicalized military actions. They will reduce cooperations in all states. This is not just a battle against ISIS. It's a battle against all rogue nations in the world who pose a global threat to our community. All of them will refuse cooperation when we understand that they are no longer above killing your leaders without your consent and without your cooperation. We are very proud to preserve the global community as one that is logical, rational, and respects international humanitarian rights.
To end the government bench, I'd like to invite the speaker.
There's a misunderstanding coming from side opposition. They think that we only want to take out Bashar, in the meantime ignore IS. That's exactly the opposite of what we're saying. We're saying clearly what Nat said in her speech, which is that the two are interlinked. This is not a 5-course restaurant menu where you can have your appetizer and then your dessert. We need to tackle both at the same time, to use that analogy. So the way to best do that is actually to tackle Bashar al-Assad while still continuing IS. Each in isolation will not work, and I'll explain first why each one will not necessarily work and why that strategy is not going to work on its own. So then I will tell you the comparative of outcomes when we allow for the assassination of Bashar to go out, the symbolic importance that he holds that was never engaged with in that speech, and why that will lead to at least a longer time frame where the rebels can in fact regroup and be allowed to even exist. Whereas under your model, the rebels will probably be wiped out, and in the end, the only two options are bad or worse, IS or Bashar, something that we don't want to happen as our only outcomes. First, a couple of rebels. The last thing I'm going to say about OO, because I don't think they're still in this debate, is that there's a thing that they're running about alienating Arab nations, for example, and like Bashar should be included because he's worked with us in the past, such as, for example, on chemical weapons, for example. He has agreed to those chemical weapons deals, but he has not come through on those, and he's been consistently delaying on those. So he's just making those promises just to keep the international community hung on a leash, but never actually do anything. We don't think that's any evidence that we should therefore trust him any further. Done with opening opposition. Let's question now why the sequencing that they want to also talk about, right? About IS, like first target IS, then Bashar that they want to talk about is not going to work. For the biggest reason is not going to be successful because IS is going to grow even stronger. This is the same strategy we've been using with airstrikes in Iraq, but the reason why it's not been working are several. First, we've already picked off all the easy targets in Iraq where IS was open in their convoys and their buildings that we knew that they were storing weapons and other things that we could target. They've gotten smarter and they've moved those things out of open view. We don't know where those things are. The only way to still consistently be able to target them is if to actually target civilian populations and civilian structures. So this was large amount of civilian casualties, which feeds into the characterization given to you by Natalie, in which IS can use that rhetoric to gain more supporters into the region. Because this is how IS has grown stronger over the past, when they're able to say that the West has come in this hegemony and has like attacked you and killed you. We will protect you from the West. And this is the same thing that gets them recruits against Bashar as well. Have a seat, guys. So we don't think that's necessarily a good option to have. The only other option, therefore, if you still want to tackle IS effectively, is to send in troops, which we all sides know that there is no political will for and will result in the same sort of rhetoric being used by IS. That's something that's untenable. What about working with Bashar? Let's see if maybe we can try to work with him to go against IS. Why will that not work? Look, Bashar has already been fighting against IS like tooth and nail, just like Natalie already told you. If he was able to be in any way successful against him, he would have been already. Something that Mai never even tackled in that speech. Have a seat. So the reason why, that's obviously why Bashar wanted the U.S. to join in and help in the first place. I said, oh, we're offering the U.S. our help, but Bashar can't really offer any marginal help that the U.S. can't gain on its own. Sure, together they might be able to take out IS, but that has the problem of the U.S. being seen as complicit with Bashar al-Assad, meaning that all the other Arab nations will revolt against that. This means that the people on the ground in Syria will also be more likely to move towards IS as they see that Bashar and the U.S. has betrayed them and don't want to actually help them at all. This is even worse for that situation because it makes the U.S. complicit. So we don't think that's also an effective option of cooperating with Bashar in that case to work with them. Let's deal with Mai's extension here. I see you bouncing around. Have a seat. Mai wants to tell us their big extension is that Bashar now will be forced under our model to realign with IS, and somehow they're going to become allies. This is the most ridiculous extension we heard in today's debate, because Bashar loyalists, have a seat, are loyalists to Bashar. They don't believe in IS. They have an ideological belief in the supremacy of Bashar al-Assad and his rule and reign over Syria. They have ignored all the atrocities he has done and stuck with him through thick and thin. Even when Bashar looked like he might be losing, they stuck with him. Even when Bashar was chemical gassing his own people, they still stuck with him. We don't think those people are going to be incentivized to move to IS, because even they will fight tooth and nail to the death. Even if they think IS is encroaching upon them, they will continue to remain loyal to Bashar. IS is not going to reach out. IS is similarly not going to reach out to Bashar loyalists to work with them, because then they will be seen as complicit and hypocritical, something that IS cannot afford to be seen as well, because they want to gain more support by saying, look, we are defending the correct Ummahtic nation of Islam. We are fighting both against the West and against the oppressive Arab regimes that were once puppets of the West. This takes out all their rhetoric when they therefore join with Bashar. We see no reason why those two have any sort of incentive to work together at all. The last thing she wants to tell us in her seat, have a seat, is that, then under our model, we have no idea who's ever going to take power. That's going to be even worse. But that's where Natalie's extension came in. Before I get into that, closing.
That Assad and ISIS are not intertwined, because people who are pro-Assad are anti-ISIS, and taking them out together will align them, because now the ISIS didn't kill Assad, the West killed Assad.
That's not necessarily true, because the people who are on the ground are only choosing between two bad options. They're choosing between which one am I more likely to survive against, right? So that's why they join either one, right? So that's people are going to make those cost-benefit decisions one way or the other. What we're saying is we can influence those decisions to be more in favor of the third option, the rebels in our case, that are practically the only long-term hope that we have of establishing any sort of thing. Look, here's the thing. Establishing the rebels and funding them, have a seat, guys. I'm not taking any more. The only way, funding the rebels was always going to be a long-term thing. We were in Iraq for years and funded them $2 billion, training their armies, building up intelligence relationships, and building up who we know within the military structure, and we still couldn't fight IS there. So the idea that we could therefore fund the rebels and find out the martyr between them in a few months was never going to be realistic. However, but it's better that we try to do that and give them time that rebels will still exist under our model. How does that happen? When we assassinate Bashar, this is when we take out the charisma, the symbolic character, and the power of Bashar as the glorious leader of Syria, something that the military and the people of Damascus buy into, who are his main supporters, and the Alawites as well. When we take that person out, what's more likely to happen is a business leader from the Alawites, for example, or a military leader will therefore step into place. There's two possible options that this person will take. One, that person will therefore see the error of Bashar's way and see the only way for them to get out of this situation is to negotiate with the US, with the West, with the Arab League, and somehow come to some sort of reasonable solution. But even in the worst case, if this person doesn't turn out to be reasonable, we still think this is something worth doing. Why is this so? Because at the very least, there is still factions within the Alawites, as Natalie already mentioned. There will be infighting between them as they try to fill the power vacuum of who's going to take over the military structure, of the businesses, of the money, of the economy that Damascus therefore controls. In that infighting, the military will be broken up and will not have a clear chain of leadership, at least for several months and for a long time while they try to recover. At that time, that's when the rebels can therefore refocus their efforts and their group to still exist and survive, and people can therefore move towards them rather than through ISIS or Bashar. It's going to take a long time to focus and help the rebels and aid them and give them monetary weapons and that sort of thing. But at the very least, they're able to survive, whereas in the status quo, they will eventually be taken out by either Bashar or IS, in which case they're only left with two bad options, the IS or Bashar, something we don't want to leave Syria. We give them the third option in the long term. We're very proud to propose.
All right. And to end the semifinals of the UKM IV 2014, I invite the opposition witness. Kenneth.
Yeah. To tackle both ISIS and Assad is something clearly impossible. Because let's look at status quo. It's really extremely hard to eliminate ISIS as a whole. You pushing your forces against a two-way battle, against two forces, means you risk losing the entire war, completely furthering, exacerbating the entire problem within those kind. Because we think that Assad also has a common goal with the United States, which is to eliminate ISIS. You going against Assad in these circumstances risks you losing everything that you wanted to, including solving the problem of Assad's rule and his dictatorship. I'm going to ask you two questions today. Firstly, on why it becomes a rallying point to regroup and to be stronger once you eliminate Assad via assassination. And secondly, the harms of changing the dynamics of the interaction between the West and other rogue states and other Arabic states. But before that, let's make few clarification in terms of like factual stuff and so and so. Firstly, let's recognize that OG's contextualization is entirely wrong, because the battle there is a three-way battle. And more importantly, Assad is immensely against ISIS as a whole, which debunks the entire idea coming from OG. But secondly, we think that the leader of the ISIS is actually Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. It's not al-Assad, for example. We think that if they really want to cripple ISIS as a whole, why on earth target Assad? Why not target Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi? That's a major factual error coming from them. But thirdly, we think that the ISIS are against Assad as a whole. Another factual error coming from them, because the ISIS are immensely radicalist Sunni groups. They are against Assad forces, which are Alawites. But fourthly, even if opening government suggests that killing Assad will still solve the problem, using that very logic, it only martyrdizes Assad as a whole, in which Assad's loyalists would gain more strength and be united against Americans as a whole. But fifth, we tell you that the opposition is actually disjointed. You don't have like a ready opposition ready to take power. We think that they are disjointed between radicalist group and moderate groups that can't even come to an agreement that if Assad actually falls, who on earth would actually lead Syria in the post-Assad era. So we think that the opposition in those kind of countries are not reliable at the moment. So, okay, on to the first question, why it becomes a rallying point to regroup and be stronger. Because Mai told you that when the West attack Assad, it will only make Assad forces join with ISIS as a whole. But Hazem came and told you that no, ISIS would not go against Assad will not join ISIS because they are immensely against ISIS. But here's the thing. We tell that ISIS in the first place did not touch their leader, right? ISIS never even killed or threatened to kill Assad as a whole. So this neutralizes the hatred of the ISIS against them. Because we tell you that Assad's forces will feel that, look, even if we are against ISIS, ISIS is our only opt-out system because now we have a common enemy, which is to go against America as a whole. Your stance neutralize the hatred between these two parties and further strengthen ISIS as a whole. Before I move on, closing.
Given that we have been threatening Assad's sovereignty for years since we have funded the rebel army and things like that, why on earth would they suddenly go to IS even though we have pretty much showed our hatred for them for a long time?
No, okay, wait, look. They're talking about the West against Assad in the first place, few years ago, right? But we tell you that recently, Assad has showed room of negotiation in which he even go to the extent he gave information to the United States because he want to go against ISIS. Your proposal doesn't weaken ISIS, doesn't even weaken Assad. I'll further explain. And I'll further explain with this. When they told you, closing government told you that the recruitment towards ISIS were crippling the recruitment towards ISIS will lead to a better Syria. One, we tell you that it's already disjointed, right? It's a three-way battle there, not a two-way battle. Secondly, we tell you that killing Assad unites a common enemy, in which let's recognize the nature in the situation that both Assad and ISIS are not on like very friendly terms towards Western countries, but ISIS is more radical against Western countries, and Assad, is like Assad is probably still having some little room of negotiation. What you do towards this kind of situation is you unite these two, in which even though Assad's forces may be a bit hostile towards the United States, you touching on their leader, you killing their leader means that they would more likely join ISIS, the explanation that we told you earlier on. So the comparison between both sides is this. We think that the side government would never ever like create a better situation post-assassination. How is this so? Because we tell you that Assad would more likely join ISIS. Because we tell you that this unites both common enemy, in which Assad's supporters would join ISIS. This makes ISIS further strengthened with further stranglehold on Syria, and we think that Syria also risks losing the entire Syria towards ISIS itself. But moreover, during Hazem's speech, he told you Assad is so powerful and that his followers will always support him regardless of whatever the circumstances. But using that very logic and principle, it means that you killing Assad would strengthen Assad's forces, right? They would radicalize, it become a rallying point in which Assad is the martyr, our common enemy is the Western forces. Let's go against the Western forces. We are being stronger now. Sit down. On my second question, why the harms of changing the dynamics of the interaction between West and rogue nations? Because let's recognize that there are certain cooperation between the West and the Arabic states, for example, like in the Iran nuclear sanction and these kind of things. Because we tell you that the West always say that, look, we're trying to cooperate with you. Because the West always say that, look, we are trying to share our good principles. We share our principles of not assassinating individuals, but capturing the individual and charging the individual in any particular court that would solve the problem. What killing Assad does is that, firstly, we tell you that the Arabic states who have paranoia and always suspect the United States for having ulterior motives against them. But two, it further worsens the relationship between the West and Arabic nations, in which the West cannot now estimate what the Arabic nations are trying to do. So all your stuff like the Iran nuclear thing, all those talks will even falter when US does this kind of thing. So the comparison between both sides is this. Their side never allows room for negotiation between the rogue states and Western states, in which they always feel that the Western nations are trying to impose something on them. Always have the principles of war by assassinating people. On our side, we still have room for negotiation. We think that an example of Iran, which massively moderated after interaction between the West, these are the benefits coming from our side, something their side never provide. For all those reasons, we take today's debate.
Thank you very much. Cross-law, shake hands. We'll meet back here for the results. Someone from UKM.